Okay, good afternoon. This is LS589, and today we're going to talk about CMS and what we call nowadays WCMS. So this class is named from CMS to WCMS, which I will explain uh, in a few seconds. Okay, first let's define what a CMS is. CMS stands for Content Management System. And the idea was that with a CMS at the beginning, it was a text editor. And it was a text editor to build the web, to build web content. As you know, we have to make a difference between what the internet is, which is a network of computers that are linked together in the world, and what web content is. Web content is the information that travels through the internet. So a CMS was and is a tool for building for web building, for information building. Nowadays, what we understand as a CMS is what we call a WCMS. It's a Web Content Management System. And we like to say Web Content Management System, so we added the W, okay, to make a distinction of what it was at the beginning, because a content management system may not be web based, but when we add the web, now we see we actually are talking about this is a content management system that exists in the web to do what? Well, to deliver content, to deliver information that is not only text bound, but also we have image and we have sound. So it's building the web with multimedia. Okay. So the difference is the W, just to make sure that we are talking about web content. So it's a web content management system. Now, there is a very interesting thing here, and we will see an example between what is the dynamic web and the static web. The WCMS, the Web Content Management Systems, are it's dynamically generated web pages or web information, which means that it creates information content from the back end, and that's a database. That's we will see a figure now, a model that it starts with a request from a web client. And let me explain what I mean. Here we have the first one is the static model, and the second one is the dynamic model. In the past, and this is not prehistory, but as you know, the internet is quite new. In the past, in the 1980s and 1990s, what we had was mostly, and we still do, static web pages, which means that you build those pages using HTML, which is the markup language, and whenever a user would get the URL of our page, it will display the same information. So that's why it's called static, because the information in the web page will remain the same until the manager of the page change the information. Okay, but if that person doesn't change the information using HTML, the information display will always be the same. That is why it's called an static web page. But now with the new technologies, and now I'm talking about the last few years, we can display dynamic web pages or dynamic information. Why? Because, and here is the second model here that we have, because because in the back end, and this is the back end here where it says web server, here we can see the same thing, but in the back end today, we have a PHP, which is a programming language, and we have a database. A database that is normally uses SQL, and we will see what SQL is later on. So in this case, when there is a, like I said here, when there is a request, the page will be created with the information that PHP will retrieve from the database. That means that when that database has been transformed, when more records have been added or deleted, the information displayed in the web page will be differently. That is why it's a dynamic web page. While in the first model, the one up here, it will always display the same information unless someone, in this case, the page manager or the web designer, changes the information. Of course, there are still static web pages, but dynamic web pages are becoming more common. But the difference is that in the back end, and by the back end, this is what I mean. In the static page, there is a web server, and you have the HTML there. In the dynamic page, you have the web server too, but you have PHP technology and you have SQL technology. Okay, and SQL technology means that you have the language to design a database. It's the language that we use to design and program a database. Okay, so the information changes as the database changes. So if a new record is added, the information display in the active web page or the dynamic web page will be differently. Okay, in the static web page, we have to change the HTML because there is no a database system feeding the static web page. While in the dynamic web page, there is a database system feeding the page. That's the difference. And that's something that we have to take into consideration. We have some keywords that I've been talking. One is PHP, and that's what we saw right here, that we have in the dynamic web pages. And that's a programming language, and it supports database interaction. That's why it's so important to have PHP when you have SQL and when you have to have a dynamic web page. In the case of a WCMS, in the case of a web content management system, you need that because you want it to be a dynamic web page. Then we have HTML, and we also saw talk about the HTML right here as the hypertext markup language, and that's the standardized system for tagging text files to achieve font, color, graphic, hyperlink effects on the web. And it means displaying data. That's the language. That's a program language that we use to display data. Then there is XML, which is also a markup language, but in this case, it describes data. Okay, it not only display, but it's mostly for describing data. And a web server. Here we have the web server right here in this model. In both models, we have the web server. The web server is a computer system, meaning there is hardware, software, and is connected to the network. And the most common application, of course, is to host websites, either dynamic or static. Okay, and Another example of a web server application, of course, is the ILS system. And in libraries, when we go into our, we go to an OPAC, okay, let me put here an OPAC. That's host in a web server. And an OPAC, of course, is a dynamic website. Why? Because when you add a new record to your OPAC, it will, and there is a user request, well, the new record will be displayed if the user through the user request. Okay, so it is a dynamic site. This is an example of a dynamic site. Again, if you add a record to the database that is in the back end of your OPAC, a record of a book or any other information resource, and there is a user request, then the user request will retrieve that new record because it is a dynamic website. Okay, and to be a dynamic website, you have to have in the back end a database run by SQL and a PHP interpreter. Okay, and MySQL is the name of a open source relational database management system. And because we're talking about CMS or WCMS in this case, and we're talking about dynamic websites and dynamic web page. And I already explained that to have a dynamic website, we have to have in the back end a database. We are going to talk a little bit about what SQL or MySQL and what the database model is, because you have to have an understanding. And here is first, this is what we call a ER diagram, an entity relationship diagram. And here is an entity here, is another entity, and entities are described by attributes, okay? And entities are related to one another. For example, just like a family, the father is related to the son or to the daughter or to the wife. And well, other examples. An entity may be a book. Well, a book it's one entity. An author is another entity, and they are related because the author have written the book. So entities have relationships, and entities have attributes. Attributes describe an entity. For example, in the case of a book, the attributes of the book may be the color, the number of pages, the date it was published. Those are attributes of that entity called book. And in the case of authors, well, an author have a name, have a date of birth, may have a nationality. Those attributes, those are attributes that describe a entity called author. Okay, as it may have of course, it will have gender, sex, etc. So if you take my database class that I'm going to teach on the spring, I'll show you how to do a ER diagram. And it's a very good logic to understand organization of information, okay? Because through this logic, logic or model, the ER diagram, we can see what the entities are and how they are related to one another, and what attributes each entity has. Then, once we have the ER modeling that I show you here, we develop that model into a relational database, and we do that using SQL, and that's what is behind the dynamic websites, and that is the back end of any WCMS, of any web content management system. And here we have, for example, 3 tables. And one table is the student, the other table is named courses and takes courses. As we can see, there is a relationship within these 3 entities. And for example, a record goes in horizontal form. Okay, and the attributes go in vertical. So students have the following attributes that describe the student: the ID, the name, the phone, and the DOB, the date of birth. And here are the records. One record is 500, the other record is 501, 502, etc. They have a relationship, or there is a relationship with the classes and the semester, because students are taking courses. And the courses, there is another table called named courses with the following attributes: class ID, title, and class number. So this is how a relational database works. I'm not going to go into more detail about this because this is another class. This is 541, and if you're interested in understanding the logic and the model of the ER diagram and relational databases, I will encourage you to take 541. Why is 541 relevant to us? Because it's how we organize, it's one way to organize information. And when we go to the ILS system and we see, for example, the patrons module or the OPAC, the online catalog, what we are looking at is the relational table database model. Okay, we're looking at relational tables, and if we understand the logic of relational tables, we can do queries, and we can get more information of our catalog. So SQL and it's is at the back end of every ILS. Okay. And of course, when we have ILS, one of the modules is the one that publishes the website on the internet, and it's a dynamic website because it is fed from the database through PHP. Some examples of web content management systems are Drupal, WordPress. I have a site. I have a site there, but I never update it. We have Blogger by Google, and of course Joomla. So these are examples of content management, web content management systems. Okay, in this semester we're going to work with Joomla. I already provide you what you are going to do during this week. Okay, while you are watching the videos and getting familiar with Joomla, I'll be adding also more lectures or micro lectures because I don't want it to be very extensive on web technologies. So you get familiar with the language. So the idea here was I want to recapitulate. The idea of this lecture was so we understand what a static website is or a dynamic website is and the difference. We understand some of these keywords. We understand I'm sorry, the logic of the database, the entity relationship diagram, and the relational database logic. And finally, we see some examples of web content management systems. Okay, thank you.